Hello, my name is Aengus MacGrianna, and you're very welcome to the Resolution Room, a monthly podcast on behalf of Mediation Northern Ireland and Ulster University, where we explore with guests how the process of mediation can bring great improvements and benefits to our daily connections with others. Be those connections with our family, our neighbours, community, cross-community, work colleagues or organisations. We all navigate conflict daily, and we all have a particular response or reaction to conflict or potential conflict when it arises. Some of our personal go-to methods work in some situations and not in others. That's where mediation can and does make a difference in bringing difficult relationships and situations to a more workable and agreeable level. In this podcast series, The Resolution Room, we explore the myriads of ways in which mediation can transform all types of relationships and interactions between people to the benefit of all concerned. If you want to understand what exactly mediation is and how it works, go to our first podcast in the series. In today's podcast, we're going to discuss the role that mediation and facilitated negotiations can play in peace building. And here with me now to tell us more about this are mediators and facilitators, Laurie Randall and Seán Ó Baoill. Laurie and Seán, welcome to you both. Thank you very much for coming along to us today. To begin, can you both first give us a bit about your background in peace building and mediation?
Sure. So I was trained about 30 years ago as a mediator. I'm currently Mediation and Development Director in Mediation Northern Ireland. But that first work for me was around peace building mediation. So right from the very beginning, that was how do you use mediation to address the conflict here in this place?
And similarly, I've been a part of the peace movement, peace building, conflict resolution, and community relations for about 35 years, but specialised in the last 30 years in mediation, particularly inter-community and intra-community mediation.
Now, you both jointly facilitated negotiations over a 10-year period between 2003 and 2013 on the contentious Orange Order parade through the Ardoyne area of Belfast. Now, before we get into the processes themselves, can you give a brief timeline of the key events that were involved in that?
Yeah, I suppose you got to think of that time was about 5 years after the Good Friday Agreement, the changeover from the RUC to the PSNI. So a lot of institutions were trying to bed down, and it was actually a time of great turmoil. Government was continually in a period of collapse throughout that time. More than half of the time that we were involved in this mediation and negotiation, there was no Stormont. And people were saying, okay, the war's over, so who won? And one of the ways you can tell who won is, are we able to do what we've always done? Can we stop them doing what they've always done to us? And so parade became a surrogate conflict, a way of saying we have won or we have not won in this context. So it was in that context that the negotiations and mediations took place all the way through. It was because of the relationships we had prior to 2003 that we were asked in. And it was actually what sustained us throughout the 10 years of the negotiations we were involved in.
Well, maybe even just on that, supposed to notice. So we've both been authorised officers of the Parades Commission.
That's right.
And working in that area as well. So that was one of the ways.
Late 90s to early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And over that 10-year period, I mean, clearly at times certain progress was made. Were there key events in that 10-year period?
There were, and there's wee wariness of, because we're used to dealing with things confidentially, so you can't name people or events or what happened. Even 20 years on, we would still be held by those boundaries. And yet there were many things that we couldn't talk about at the time. When we first started, there were 9 different contentious parades. The Tour of the North, the Apprentice Boys, the Royal Black Receptory, Band Parades, Junior Irish Lodge, Women's Irish Lodge. A lot of those were resolved over that time. It was actually particularly the return route on the 12th of July parade, which became the sticking point, and actually now, 20 years on, is still the sticking point. So you don't get to talk about the victories, but people involved notice that instead of having 20, 30 contentious events over the marching period, you're down to one. So there certainly were key events during that, and every time there was a breach of a ceasefire, a breakdown over decommissioning, a collapse of Stormont. It absolutely impacted the negotiations that were going on.
Now, at the end of that period in 2013, that also sort of coincided with the setting up of what was known as the Trudell camp. What exactly was that, and how did that impact on further progress that was made in 2016?
Yeah. I don't like to take personal responsibility, but there is something about, as we ended in 2013, we had got as far as we could in the negotiations, and the parties themselves had come to a very deep understanding that they couldn't let the other side agree to what they wanted, because then the other side would be removed by more hardline actors. With that in mind, in 2013, they left the final decision about the return parade on the 12th of July to the Praise Commission, knowing that the Praise Commission would have to make a call one way or the other, and whatever way they called it, the parties involved in negotiation would say that's wrong. So Camp 12 grew directly out of the Praise Commission's decision in 2013 to say the return parade will not go home. And the anger that caused in the Irish community led directly to setting up Camp 12. People were very worried because of what happened down in Drumcree, that this could become a permanent encampment, a permanent protest. And for those involved, they're saying, yeah, it's actually much easier to have a permanent protest in Belfast, where all within walking distance of home, than in Portadown, halfway down the country. So there were people who were settling in for the long term, and it caused a huge amount. Some of the things that became really important were people acting in good faith. Even though everyone described everyone else acting in bad faith, the reality is, on the Republican side, they withdrew their protests. Both the GARP ones and the Cara ones were withdrawn. The police said, our job is to uphold the law for no matter how much it costs. And there were various figures up to £22 million spent on policing the nightly conflict around Camp Liddell. But they held that line. Our job is to maintain the law, maintain the peace, and let other people who are working very hard in the background do the negotiations.
You might need to say Cara and Gorka.
Sorry, Cara from the Ardoyne Residents Association, who were the ones that we mostly worked with over the 10 years. GARP would have been described as dissident Republicans, Greater Ardoyne Residents Collective, who were very much opposed to the parades and said no matter what is agreed, we won't agree to it. So these coalitions of groups became really important. On the loyalist side was the North and West Belfast Parades and Cultural Forum, which everyone knew included various armed groups, various parading groups, various community groups. So people wore a lot of different hats. And part of the process was each side assuring each other that they could deliver and they would act in good faith. By 2016, Cara Good and Jim Raleigh were brought in to help negotiate the final agreement, which was almost exactly what we had really talked about in the previous 10 years. But they needed that time. The communities needed that time. Perhaps all of Northern Ireland needed that time to realise we need to find a way out, and there's one here.
Now, in terms of peace building, there are basically kind of three elements or levels of peace building. There's conflict management, there's conflict transformation, and there's strategic peace building. Now, I suppose when we look at these three elements, can you briefly tell us a little about them and how they might relate to Northern Ireland and indeed relate to each other?
Yes, all right.
Sure. So conflict management we would see as work very much happening on the ground. So it's the how do you help to reduce tension and help people, not that they have now agreed a thing, but help them get through something difficult together with as, I suppose, as least damage done as possible in terms of what happens on the day, for example, on the day of a parade and protest, but also damage to relationships before and after as well. So conflict management, it will include, I suppose, how policing happens on the day, how communication happens on the day, levels and numbers of stewards, all of that. But that's not actually fixing the problem. That's just managing the problem to try and stop really, the worst stuff potentially happening. For us, conflict transformation is much more paying attention to how relationships change through a conflict. Again, it's not saying that there won't be conflict anymore, But how that conflict happens changes when people have an opportunity to really recognise the humanity of the other. Our process tried to provide, as well as the practical conflict management points, our process tried to really allow for some of that conflict transformation to happen in the room. People getting a chance to get beyond rhetoric to real human encounter. But as you name that third level as well, I guess it's really important. The strategic peace building, the structural change that is also needed. Because if our analysis is just that this is about a relationship that's broken down, these are, warring tribes type thing, I think that really sells it short. There were justice issues, structural issues that, as Seán has described, were happening simultaneous to our mediator work, and that allowed changes to be happening on that societal level that meant that the stuff we were doing became more possible. So I think, I was initially brought in working with the police. How they operated around parades changed significantly throughout this period. The way they would operate made something on the ground much more possible.
Now, I suppose when there's conflict, in terms of any talks, that it's either conflict mediation or conflict negotiation. Can you explain the difference even between the two?
So in a very kind of straightforward way, negotiation is normally the parties themselves, and mediation is when you're bringing in a third party who will come alongside people who have conflict, not to decide what happens, but to enable them to have the best conversation they can. So that would be the starkest difference. But that's putting it very simplistically.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the talks that took place around the Orange Order parade, it's in the Ardoyne area, which method was used? Was it negotiation or mediation?
So that's a really good question. A lot of the people involved in this felt themselves to be treated very badly by people who have tried to intervene. People coming from outside, telling them they were being mediated, doing a lot of practice that we would consider poor practice in mediation, telling both parties we kept them separately and then talked to them separately and then said, this is the best deal you've got, sign here, and calling that mediation. Now, we absolutely would not call that mediation, but having been burnt that way on a number of occasions, the reason they came to me initially was saying I had trained them in principal negotiation, and they had learned some of the language and some of the techniques. And so when they asked me and they said, can you come in, but we don't want mediation, because what we've heard called mediation is painful and abusive. We want negotiation, we want control of the process. But first they're bringing me in, they're not doing it directly themselves. And so they called it facilitated negotiation. I told them I would be using mediative skills, and they accepted that. And part of that negotiation that I had with them, as they asking them to bring me in, was, and I insist that I'm not doing it on my own. I will be working as part of a team, myself and Laurie together, male, female, Catholic, Protestant, Nationalist, Unionist, Loyalist, Republican, that those elements are in the room as well. And so they always called it negotiation in order to retain a sense of control. And they knew that we were mediators, that we were using those skills as well. So it ended up being a hybrid of facilitated negotiation with a lot of mediative elements, which kind of blurs the water a bit, but that's what was necessary for that context at that time.
And I suppose just to set the scene for these negotiations, I mean, on the question of gender, clearly there was gender given the fact that Laurie is female, in terms of facilitating these talks.
Yes.
But were there any women in the negotiating team?
Not many. Yeah. And that was something we were conscious of even as we were doing it. So mostly on the loyalist side, it was just men. I'm looking at you for confirmation on that.
Absolutely.
It was only men.
Yeah, later on, when we had much larger groups, there was a couple of women, but they were mostly silent.
Yes, and then that would be my reflection. So there would have been female residents on the Republican side
Yeah.
who were present. But yeah, they were mostly silent. I think it still makes a difference to the atmosphere in the room. Because I have been in rooms where I've been the only woman, in other work that we've been doing, and at least having some other women in the room, I think, does do something to how the conversation happens. But yeah, it was. I think it was something that I was concerned about at the time. I guess I was conscious there was other work happening outside the room that was reaching out and working more with women's groups. But it was, for me, something that was a slightly uncomfortable thing, that there wasn't more of that female voice in the room, actually. And it's one of those things you end up having to compromise on, I think, sometimes in the way a process is shaped.
And occasionally it did get a bit macho.
It did.
It's square.
It did.
And I suppose, as facilitators, though, in these talks, how important was impartiality? And I suppose, and the fact that you represented both communities?
Yeah, it was key. One of the difficulties in mediation, people classically talk about neutrality. I don't care about the outcome on either side. We many years ago moved to impartiality. I do care, but I'm not biased towards one side or another. And we tend to use the term multi-partiality. I care for you and I care for them. And I understand you and understand them. So we talked about this recently. You needed to understand the subtleties of what people said. A simple question like, can you deliver on your community? And the answer is yes. That sounds like a straightforward question and answer. But you need to know when loyalists ask, Cara, can you deliver? What they're really saying is, we know that GARC, the dissidents, are in the background and said they will not accept any agreement. We need to know, are you willing to face down dissident Republicans if it comes to it? And that's what loyalists meant when they asked the question, can you deliver? And that's absolutely what Cara said when they said yes. It was an offer, we will face down these people in our own community who are much more hardline. We're committing to you that we'll do that. You need to know that that's what the question means, that's what the answer means. So we need to be close enough to the communities that we know what those terms mean. We've grown up here all our lives, but we need to not be so in those communities that we can't step out of that role. So it's useful that we were not from North Belfast. It was the most damaged, most hurt, most traumatised part of the most traumatised city in Northern Ireland. And they knew that. It's not to dismiss them because of that. It's actually to honour their wisdom and their courage. They had to go back to their houses every night and face attacks from their own people on both sides for having the courage to keep going to talks in the face of breakdowns, of violence, of abuse, and of trauma. So I absolutely recognise that they were in that. It was important for us to not be from those communities, but to really understand those communities and to have different perspectives and to check with each other. So we would, every time we had a meeting, we'd have a review afterwards. I remember one particular moment where Laurie noticed that I came in quicker with the Republicans to curb particularly violent language. And I was saying, I do it to both. You say yes, but you're a little faster. If it's a half a second to come in on the loyalists, it's a quarter of a second on the Republicans. Why?
You're quicker and you're harder.
I'm quicker on my heart on my own Republican community. Why? Because I'm a bigot. Because somewhere deep down in me, despite many years of doing this work, I expect loyalists to be badly behaved. Because that's what I grew up believing. But when Republicans behave badly, they're letting the side down. That's you're letting the family down. Behave yourself. I'm a bigot. After years and years and years of doing this work, I am not completely impartial. And I had better make sure that somebody in the room will notice that and will hold my feet to the fire. So it's really important that there was somebody there saying, I will notice, I will pay attention, I'll say it to you even when it gets uncomfortable.
I mean, that's a very human response, and thank you for that. But we are humans, and we all have feelings. And I suppose in these kind of talks where there's a lot of tension, I'm sure that there were many times that you faced many sorts of dilemmas. But does that lead to utter frustration, anger, fear, and even especially, I suppose, when you come to the question of competing rights.
Absolutely. There were many occasions where we had things we call sphincter moments. The places just where you parked your car. I used to always park in the Republican side. That's where I knew my way in and out of more comfortably. But one particular event, I came back to find I was driving a red car at the time, came back to that street where I parked my car, and there's a red car upside down on fire. And I'm literally going, how do I get home tonight? There's a riot that's kicked off. This was my way home. And then the thing that surprised me, I looked in the back, I had no children at the time, and there was baby stuff in the back. And that's not my car. I had actually that time parked in the Holy Cross Monastery. I could get home. And that walking away, there was a sense of relief, but also recognizing somebody with kids has their car turned upside down and on fire, and I get to go home. And there's a human cost to that, knowing that my sense of relief is a cost to someone else. And so, absolutely, the frustration that's there. Some of the frustration that people would say, how can you work with these people? I was always impressed by their compassion, their wisdom, their courage. And the frustration was that I couldn't say, actually, the people you're talking about, I've seen them pay the cost of keeping going to talks with their enemies. And I admire them. It's not just I'm frustrated, but what I'm frustrated by is that I can't tell you all about it,
And I suppose, like Laurie, as well, would you find that in these situations that you constantly have to sort of check yourself about your own emotions, your own reactions to what's going on in the room?
Yeah, definitely not pretending that's not happening, but being aware of it. As Seán said, there's something about co-working that allows for that, particularly with someone who can challenge you afterwards. There's a safety in that. But there would have been times when I was overwhelmed by even the responsibility of of the implications if things didn't go well in the ring, what might happen next. Really trying to be so careful in the work. And times when I was afraid for my safety, where I, particularly I suppose even maybe prior to these negotiations, in my early days as an authorised officer of the Parades Commission, where I parked in the wrong place and felt very nervous about having to walk through crowds of folk who are wondering who I was, and me getting into a diesel car and having to wait for the light to come on before I would turn the key. And I could see people approaching the car, and I'm thinking, like, I'm never making that mistake again. I have messed up. Building relationship with people removed some of the fears I would have had in the early days of this work, including that there were times we were working with people who weren't on ceasefire, in the earlier part of our work on parades, and having to check out with police, is it okay to go to a particular meeting, or getting locked in rooms. On each side of the community, there were times I was locked in with a group of very angry men and not sure, how do I get out of this room again? So yeah, personal fear. But I think the biggest issue really was concern for what might happen on the ground, knowing that that's really where you saw the cost paid.
Now, you mentioned building relationships. Obviously, that's certainly as you as a facilitator. But in mediation, normally people have some type of relationship, be it that they're neighbours, they're co-workers, they have a problem at work, they have some established kind of relationship with the other person in mediation. But in these talks, I suppose, often some of the people coming face to face may not necessarily know each other or have built any actual relationship to one another. So therefore, in order to be able to get people to negotiate and to work together, you actually have to build some sort of rapport between them.
Absolutely. I mean, that building relationship, building rapport, is an essential part of it. Actually, in reality, the people, particularly at the tops of the negotiations, were quite sophisticated in terms of their information about each other and what organisations they were in and what they had done, and about us. Part of what they would do, they would check out us and who we are, what we had done. So there was certainly knowledge there, but that human understanding was hard. I often talk about a particular moment where the negotiations got bigger, as it looked like we were going to sign something off, and we had to bring in representatives from groups and political groups in a very private meeting. We were aware of they need to be hosted as well. And Laurie had brought fruit and chocolates and no plates, no cups. So you have paper cups to hand around. And there's a moment where a senior Republican and a senior Loyalist give each other fruit and chocolates, handing it into each other's hand from a paper cup, which is about human relationships, respect, rapport. A thing that surprised me because time was tight. A well-known politician who likes making long speeches. As we went round, everybody had to confirm that they were agreeing this agreement. And we came to him and I thought, we don't have time for one of his long speeches. And he said, when it came to him, I agree, I think I've said enough. Brilliant. Let's move on quick. So that human recognition that we've all worked very hard, we're tired, and I don't need my ego to make another speech. That really helped. And we absolutely paid attention to that rapport building, the trust building, the clarifying what people meant when people would make statements that they thought were helpful and that landed on the other side as a threat. We would slow down. What is the threat? What's the implication? How else can we word that? That kind of stuff became really important in our practice.
Also, it was a long period. Yeah. So folk were testing each other out. And so there would be a question of, even if we're having to manage expectations about what is possible, if someone says this is what I'll do and then they do it, then next time something bigger might be able to be trusted. But you also had setbacks within that, where so that kind of building of trust and that building of rapport wasn't a straight line. Yeah. You know, there were moments where you had to do a bit of recovery as well, because of events or perceptions of what had happened, which needed to be clarified.
And I suppose once you get talks up and running and you've built up some kind of rapport between the two parties, I'm sure as facilitators in negotiations that you're constantly monitoring what's going on to ensure that those talks are not derailed.
Absolutely. And it can be very quickly derailed. People come out of talks that are confidential, that are private. Journalists doing their job will buttonhole somebody and say, how'd it go? Have you got an agreement? No. Why not? Whose fault's that? And immediately that would appear in the papers on the next day. The other side haven't spoken to their community yet. They're stopping in the paper saying the talks that broke down, it's all your fault. Mm-hmm. So part of the work they then did was, okay, whatever we agree or don't agree, we should have a line that will go to the media, including sometimes them saying, well, our analysis is different from yours. We think it's your fault. And that's what we're going to tell the media. At least the other community, the other side of the mediation, knowing that that's happening, can relax. And when their own people chancing, did you hear what came up in the newsletter? Did you hear what came up in the Irish News? You could say, yeah, I'm not surprised. So that meta conversation, the ability to step beyond the conversation and look down, became a key part of it.
And if you were to look at the structure, I mean, Laurie, sort of often there may be sort of core concerns that you're looking out for. What exactly would they be?
So whenever you're working in a room with people, you're checking how language is landing all the time. And so some of the core concerns that would be kind of named in the theory would be things like appreciation. So people like to feel that they have been really heard and that they're being, even if they're not agreed with, that what they've said is given respect or value, rather than feeling like it's being rubbished. Building an emotional connection, I suppose, between people is another key aspect. So we would talk about affiliation in the theory. Is there that human connection, that kind of, so thinking of someone leaning across, showing an axe scar in their head.
We probably should explain that. It's a circumstance where one side of the negotiating team said, you don't know the cost we paid in our own community. And this member of the other team leant over and showed a scar in his head from an axe, saying, I got that from my community for standing up for the idea of talking to you. And you then meet at a human level, way beyond all the cliches and political posturing.
respecting autonomy. And that really does link to how decisions are being made. That there's we are respecting their autonomy, and that is definitely how our whole process was shaped.
Yeah.
We were respecting their autonomy, both in the how the conversation was going to happen, but obviously the content and the outcome really belonging to the parties, but also how they would respect each other and recognise each other having a role within their community, which links to another core concern around status.
Who are you? Who do you represent?
Absolutely. So people were there with particular hats on, but other folk would have known their biography, their what else they'd done, or how they were working within their communities. All of them were people who actually gave many hours in a week to working in their communities, working for what they saw as being justice and kind of core identity kind of issues locally. So that being something that is something we're recognising and respecting, I think is really important as well. As the mediators, that we're paying attention to that. There's a stomach aspect to that, to be honest, where you're just as whatever is emerging in the room. There's a little a radar or a checking your own stomach. How is this landing for somebody? And you're reading the body language, you're reading the tone, and kind of seeing actually is there a danger point here? Is something crossing a line for someone? Is something actually quite damaging happening here? And also particularly misunderstandings where you get what someone's saying, but you can see that's not how it's landed on the other side.
Yeah.
And somehow one of these core concerns is being crossed.
Yeah.
And so whatever the the figures or whatever that are coming out, if these core concerns are at risk, the whole process is at risk.
And once you're in negotiations, I suppose any agreement can only be found where there is common ground.
Yes.
But how do you move people from initial positions of interest, when they come in, what they say they want, to an area where there is some common ground? How do you move people in that direction?
Well, I suppose people start off with the position, stuff like an evidence. These amount of attacks happened in our community, we hold you responsible, therefore. And then the therefore is there must be no more parades, or therefore we must have a right to political and religious freedom and movement. So they come with those incompatible positions. Now we know that underneath that are narratives, experiences, feelings, hopes, fears, and those are the interests. And underneath that are human needs, which actually are universal. We all need to feel safe in our own communities. We need a sense of autonomy and a sense of connection. Those are universal, but nobody's starting with the human thing of, I know you want to feel safe, I want to feel safe, let's work together. You start with your entrenched positions, and it's part of our job to help people drop down, to make it safe enough for people to drop down, to get to the shared human needs, to ask questions like, it would seem gimmicky, and people we were working with were very allergic to us doing gimmicks, and asking questions like, tell us about the first time you saw a parade. And on the Republican side, someone talks about as a young child seeing rioting and said, these people are bringing this to my community. On the other side, someone talks about holding his granddad's hand in one hand and the rope of the lodge banner in the other. And this, for him to not do that, is not just to portray his father, but his grandfather, his ancestors, his people. When you get to understand that human level, that's where you can talk about needs. Now, they still would try to be clever with each other, ask leading questions, and they were too smart to fall for that with each other. Some people who would start with questions like, do you agree we all need to share this city? They go, whoa, stop that. I know what you're getting at. No, you can't walk down the street. So they were too clever to be caught by that. But they did drop down over those years, hugely, particularly the leadership did. As we brought more and more people in, those people hadn't been through that same process, and we'd see them drop back to positions, to cliches, it's the Queen's Highway. We don't have to ask any permission. What you're saying is propaganda. And we're going, wow, I thought we started this about 5-6 years ago. Yeah, but not with these 30-40 people. So now we have to go through it again. So the patience of those in leadership helping their own communities to move along that road and saying, we've been through this. We're not beating each other over the head with positions anymore. We're really trying to negotiate and agree right forward. And I suppose in the theory it talks about the zone of possible agreement is the overlap. Where those overlaps are possible, they happened. So when we started, you had all of those parades, the Apprentice Boys, Orange, Black, Women's, Large Bands, they were all resolved. Where there wasn't overlap was in the return parade of the 12th of July evening. And do you bring bands, and do the bands have followers, and are they part of the agreement? Now, way back 2004, I was set away, and Keir Starmer had written a report that the police had upheld their human rights legislation. But at that stage, in 2004, they're saying, we really need to talk about the followers. The Grace Commission said followers were nothing to do with them. And the judge at the time, back that Judge Weatherill said, yeah, nothing to do with the Grace Commission. And here we are, 2024, last year. That's exactly what we're talking about again. What about the return parade? What about the supporters? What about the followers? So those things are still there, and that's where there isn't overlap.
And there couldn't have been agreement.
It can't be.
I suppose in the early part of our negotiation, the reason why there was no deal as such was because there wasn't a zone of possible agreement.
That's right.
If one side had said yes beyond their agreement, they just would have no longer been the negotiating team for their community. I think it is important to say we don't move people in terms of their position. That their position is their position, but what you're helping them do is share with each other their interests and needs, and additional ways of those interests being met may emerge from their conversation with each other. But for us, really important that we're not, we don't have some agenda of where we think they should get to.
Yeah. And one of the things we notice always in negotiation mediations, that which being offered always feels like a big deal for the person offering, and it always feels almost irrelevant to the person receiving it. So we had a situation at one stage where Republicans were saying the people who followed the bans, they were called them the Blue Bag Brigade because the blue bags came from the off licence. They would urinate in the gardens because there was no other place to go to the toilet. And the Republican community saying, you come and you pee in our gardens. That's not okay. You organise the parade, you sort it out. And
So a big deal for on the parading side to go and have that conversation in their own community, saying, actually, we want to come up with a solution on this, and paying for organising, but also making the case on their own side that they would provide portaloos.
let's not annoy the other side. Let's be decent. Let's be civil. Then came back to Republicans saying, we agree. We hear your position. We hear your interests. We hear your needs. We've got portaloos. And the response was, yeah, so what? Big deal. That's what I expect from a decent civilian. You don't expect a round of applause for being human. And that lands us in the face. Do you know how much we had to pay for this? Not just money, but emotional currency with our own community to say, please do this, to respect those guys. And you're just going to throw it back and say, sure, that's nothing. So those things were very painful. Every time there was movement, the dismissal of the other side's movement was a really painful part.
And in the talks, I suppose when you're confronted with competing rights, so how difficult is it to bring one community to accept the right of the other and to acknowledge each other's competing rights and to respect them? How difficult is it to move from just, well, this is what we want, to actually bring people to understand or to acknowledge and even respect the other person's position?
I suppose it's a movement for me from a yes but to a yes and. So you have, from the Human Rights Act, you have freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, but from the Good Friday Agreement you had freedom from sectarian harassment. So you have the loyalist group, prosecuting community saying, we have these human rights, and the public going, yes, but we have these other human rights, they're competing. And over the years, we did see that changing to a yes, and we have this, and so do you. And how can we work towards this? Some of them stayed there. When people try to be realistic and say, look, if we don't get this sorted out, we could drift back to violence. Part of that was an attempt to say, let's take this seriously. That lands in the ears of the other as a threat. If you don't acquiesce to our demands, we could go back to violence. So the nuance of what every word meant and how it landed became really important. For me, the thing was to move from the yes, but beating each other over the head with competing rights to let's have all of these rights and develop something that is good for everybody. That isn't about two sides arguing, but two sides facing the same direction saying, how do we resolve this together?
Now, you mentioned language there. How important is the use of language, and how do you control it, or do you have to spell it out?
Is hugely important, of course, yeah. And how people are, the words that people are using, the words we use, there could be trip steps, and helping the parties understand each other is one of the core roles of a mediator, is because often in conflict, communication has broken down. And so slowing things down, doing reframing and summarising really carefully in your facilitation role, or just asking the open question that lets that first statement be explained a bit more while the other folk get a chance to really hear that. All of that language is important. When it came to capturing some of the agreements that were emerging, they themselves would work really closely with us, the parties, on exactly how that would be worded, and even down to the punctuation and the implications of that. But I'm also remembering times when you would have, because you had trained somebody spoke in the past, you would work with them on asking authentic questions, or so we did have some common language as well through the background of shared training. There was common language we could draw on together as well, that I think was a useful ingredient in it.
And a mistake some people make who having a lot of experience tend to be, if it gets unpleasant, if it gets aggressive, it gets angry, to try and calm it, to control it, to make it nice. And that doesn't help us, deeply frustrating. So when one group said to another, you people never listen, it's really helpful for us to go, they never listen. Use the exact words, mirror it back to them, and they go, and obviously, I'm not saying they never listen, but they usually don't listen. Or if they do, they don't act on it. That really matters, that they adjust what they said. All you did was echo back, mirror back. They get to come back from that themselves, rather than being held back by us. So absolutely, every word, every moment. One of the things you said about the authentic questions, it was kind of a development of theory that went on in the reality of the moment, where we defined an authentic question as one where you're asking somebody something you don't know. If I ask you, what's your middle name? I don't know what it is. Whatever you tell me, I have to accept it. If I'm saying, no, it's not, Peter, then that wasn't an authentic question. That was a rhetorical question. And getting them to understand those nuances. What are you really looking for? This new information. And will that move us on?
We also were capturing, in terms of supporting people to think together collectively, we were also capturing words and putting them on flip charts and having them papered around the room, so people could see the progress they were making as well. Because it is complex, and it being reduced down to slogans is not helpful. But actually getting the complexity of it out in a way that people can, and they've generated that, they can get their head around it, that it really supports more creative thinking.
I suppose one of the last bits I would say is the control of how we define this, whether we're drawing diagrams, maps, words, processes, is back to them and back to them until they know that their conclusions, their agreements will be respected. It's never going to be imposed by us, the Race Commission, by the police, anyone else. They entirely own this. They own the failures and they own the success. So actually, when we think about it, Ardoyne, it was more or less resolved around 2016. It came up again last year. And yet they immediately stepped into the same processes. They spoke to each other, they spoke to Howard Good, and their understanding, this is our problem, this is our responsibility, and the solutions that they're reaching are their solutions. There's no Mediation Northern Ireland solution, there's no Laurie and Seán solution, it belongs to the people of Ardoyne.
And to what degree, I suppose, in these kind of negotiations, was it constantly sort of direct negotiations between the two parties, as opposed to were there times that they actually began to work collaboratively together in terms of seeking a solution? You know, how much was it trading, or how much then would it move into a zone where they would try to collaborate in terms of seeking a solution?
They were very careful. They all have different roles, which includes being part of mobile phone networks when violence kicks off. And they absolutely separated those roles themselves. So they continued to work together on things like mobile phone networks. And they didn't leak from confidential conversations about what we would do about parades. They kept that from the parade. So I think they did extremely well over the time, watching those boundaries of role.
Oh, I think what you're naming is these are folk who were partnering maybe on community development issues in the background, as well as other community relations things in the room. Yeah, I mean, they definitely were working creatively together to see what might be possible, like exploring how would it be if. And having to be careful about that, because the fear was if you even mention a maybe, does that get locked in as the, here's what's going to happen?
I already offered that.
Yeah. But I think they did get pretty sophisticated with each other on exploring the what ifs, but recognizing that other stuff would need to happen for that to be possible. I saw enormous courage in how they worked together, and moments of actually deep generosity, while still having that realism of, and we've a community to go back to here, or we've a lodge to go back to, or that it wasn't like you could just pretend the world out there didn't exist. But yeah, I saw amazing peace building happening from the people in those rooms.
Now, you mentioned obviously going back to their own communities. So it was a bit like, I suppose, that people were very conscious that they were going to have to sell whatever it was that they were going to agree.
Yes.
Yeah, and then almost the partnership is not just that recognition that whatever I say in the room, I'm going to have to sell, but whatever you say in the room, you're going to have to sell. And their recognition of each other's dilemmas around that, I think was important.
People get themselves on hooks that they can't get off. The Ardoyne said they wouldn't negotiate with Republicans, and yet they had to in order to move on. So there's a lot of work went into making sure that the Church of Ireland bishop invited the Orange Order to enter talks. And if the Church of Ireland bishop does that, then the Catholic bishop would better invite people as well. And if they invited them, they'd better turn up. So they turned up to one particular meeting, and we asked them to start it with a wee prayer. And the two bishops said, we don't want to be too churchy. We said, your bishops, get over it. Stay up there. It gives the people in this room permission to talk. We need to get that permission. You're providing it. So they did a wee prayer, and then they sat back and very humbly didn't interfere, but they had to be there and they had to do the invitation. That gets people off their own hooks. Everybody knew it was a kind of a stage management, but it was to get people off hooks that they'd got themselves on, that they had made publicly. If you had said things like, I will never, how do you change that? Yeah, and they were very gracious about helping each other get off the hooks that they created for themselves.
And allowing for people's integrity, actually, because a lot of the folk there, they are coming from deep places of integrity. There were reasons why they ended up in those hooks in the first place.
Yes.
And so finding a way that actually fitted with their values was really, that was something they had to find.
Yeah, that's at the needs level. That's not our positions.
Yeah.
Well, very clearly from what you both told us, I mean, not only like a long period of time, but clearly a very complicated process over that 10-year period that you were involved. But Laurie and Seán, thank you both so much for coming in. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you both, and thank you so much. Now, to those listening, if you're interested in gaining mediation skills to handle conflict better, be that managing difficult conversations or conflict resolution management, or if you want to avail of our services to resolve a dispute or conflict, go to the website of Mediation NI, and that's www.mediationni.org, or click on the links below and contact us. Well, that's the end of today's podcast, The Resolution Room. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed and learned from it. In our next podcast, we'll be talking to Mark McAllister, Chief Executive of the Labour Relations Agency, and John Conahan, Interim Managing Director at Mediation NI, about mediation in the workplace. Until then, from me, Aengus MacGrianna, and the podcast team, thanks for listening.